This is a video about the most important man you've never heard about. It's gonna take some twists and turns, but trust me, it's gonna remain interesting. Jack Parsons was born on the 2nd of October 1914 as Marvel Whiteside Parsons in Los Angeles. He had the same name as his father, but when his mum found out that Big Daddy was sleeping around with a hooker, they separated and he was henceforth called Jack or John. And though he continued to generally refer himself by one of these two names throughout his life, he never actually legally changed it. His mother's parents, the Whitesides, had a lot of cash, so they moved to Pasadena, California, in with their daughter and son, whom they had bought a mansion. And when I say a lot of cash, I mean buying a mansion not just anywhere, but in one of the most expensive areas in the country, and also having domestic servants in that mansion. As a child, Jack Parsons did not have many friends. He was effeminate, introverted, and preferred reading books over talking to people. His grades were poor, and he was bullied at school by basically everyone except a working-class kid named Ed Foreman, who shared his fascination with rockets and sci-fi. Which, at this point, rockets and sci-fi were basically synonymous. Science fiction as a genre still had to come into its own. It was not taken seriously as a literary genre at all. And the en vogue writers of the day were Hugo Gernsback and H.G. Wells. United by their shared passion, at high school age, Ed and Jack would build experimental black powder rockets and then send them off in the Parsons' backyard. They did their more destructive experiments, and they were destructive because they were literally just blowing stuff up, in the Arroyo Seco Canyon, which would eventually become one of the pivotal locations of their lives. But to be fair, they were doing more than just playing around. They were actually legitimately experimenting with different materials and fuel sources. But sci-fi was not Parsons' only passion. He also took a great interest in magic and occultism, going so far as to perform a ritual that would just summon the devil in his house. And after completing it, he did actually believe that it had worked, because he experienced some things that he hadn't experienced before, and so he didn't do any more occult stuff, at least for some time. Because of his bad grades, Jack was sent to a different high school, the John Muir High School, and I only mention the name of this high school because John Muir is a super interesting character in its own right, and he will also get one of these videos one day. Despite being in different high schools now, he continued to be friends with Ed Foreman, and they continued to do their experiments, even when his mum sent him to a different high school again because of his bad grades. This was a military boarding school, and in true military boarding school fashion, he was expelled for blowing up the toilets. And by the way, he was expelled for blowing up the toilets is how they say it on his Wikipedia page even. Then the Great Depression came, and even the obscenely wealthy Whitesides were forced to downgrade to a more modest estate. Not wanting to skimp on Jack's education though, they sent him to one of those mamby-pamby liberal schools where they don't value discipline and actually teaching kids something. And he thrived there. He's especially interested in chemistry, and especially interested in the kind of chemistry that does boom. He got a student job at a power company and used his funds, as well as things that he stole from the company, to continue his experiments with Ed Foreman. They talked to a lot of people during that time who were considered pioneers of rocketry, such as Wernher von Braun, who at this point was still living in Germany. You may know him as either a Sturmbannführer in the SS, or alternatively as one of the founding fathers of NASA, recruited via Operation Paperclip. When Parsons graduated, he wanted to go to college, but unfortunately the tuition was too high. He instead continued working at the power company, where he did reasonably well for someone in the Great Depression. He also studied chemistry and physics in his spare time, which was considerably more difficult back then on account of there not being an internet. In 1934, Parsons and Foreman went to a lecture by Eugen Zenger, who at this point was both in the SS and the Nazi Party, at the California Institute of Technology. They felt like they needed to get in touch with serious rocket scientists, which at the time was an oxymoron for many. You have to understand that back then, the idea of rockets, and especially the idea of rockets for the purposes of exploring space, was considered to be childish science fiction stuff. The kind of thing you would read in adventure books, not something that actual serious scientists and engineers should think about. The only people who were really interested in it, aside from some visionaries, were military elements, who were mostly interested in rocket technology for jet planes. You have to consider that flight had been around for like 20, 30 years at that point. and now people wanted to put things into tubes and then explode the bottom of those tubes and send things into the sky, across the planet, and into space. Through the lecture, Parsons and Foreman met a PhD student named Frank Molina, who was as interested in rockets as they were. Together, they made an excellent team. Molina designed the rockets, Foreman built the rockets, and Parsons provided the rocket fuel. Through a Caltech professor, they were able to secure funding so they could do experiment at the same site where they had played with rockets as kids, Arroyo Seco. However, the Great Depression was still in full swing, so very soon the money ran dry. The three became very good friends. They would get together, smoke weed, talk sci-fi, and teach each other skills. Inside Caltech, they were known as the Suicide Squad because their experiments, if anything, got more blowy-uppy over time, shall we say, and they may or may not have always taken appropriate safety precautions. In 1935, Parsons married Helen Northrop. She would always have to compete with his first great passion. The boys tried to finance their research themselves, going so far as Parsons illegally manufacturing nitroglycerin in his home laboratory that he had and selling it on the grey market, and also pawning his wife's engagement ring. The biggest problem with what our rocket boys were doing is that they lacked credentials. Molina was the only person in Suicide Squad who had any sort of qualifications at all, and all of their experiments were considered stupid and dangerous. Plus, again, people did not take rocketry seriously at the time. So Jack Parsons did what any sane person would do, and built a car bomb. Don't worry, he didn't go IRA, but he was called upon as an expert witness in the trial of LAPD Police Captain Earl Kennett, who was accused of murdering a former detective after he became a whistleblower. At the time, the LAPD was super corrupt, which has totally changed now, and they are not doing the bidding of wealthy Hollywood celebrities at all times and turning a blind eye to any crimes they might commit against people who are not as influential or wealthy as them, and they have no involvement at all with organized crime that might be smuggling cocaine to the parties of wealthy movie stars in their huge mansions. I'm really glad that times have changed. Parsons built the bomb with which the detective was killed, explained how it worked, and then blew it up to prove that he was right. Earl Kennett was convicted, and Parsons was now considered a proper scientist. He did at that point begin taking some classes at USC, but his grades were pretty average. Meanwhile, the Suicide Squad was expanding. One of the new additions was Sir Shen-Tsun, who would eventually go on to become one of the great pioneers of cybernetics. Another one was Sidney Weinbaum, who had fled persecution in Europe not only because he was a Jew, but also because he was a devout Marxist. The Suicide Squad became the birthplace of a secret communist discussion group inside Caltech, and Parsons was taken with many socialist ideas, though he would eventually come to despise Stalin and the Soviet Union for what they did to their people. While he did join the ACLU, which was considered a subversive organization at the time, he did not join the American Communist Party. This actually splintered and broke up the Suicide Squad, and by 1938 only the OGs were left. They had, however, developed their rocket engine to a reasonable degree of efficiency and also time at which it could burn over the past few years, and were even allowed to do some experiments on the Caltech campus. This was less than ideal on account of even their milder experiment having a tendency to just sort of damage equipment and structures on campus. When they did eventually in the future get a budget from the federal government, they used a quarter of that to pay for the damages they were causing. But remember how Jackie Boy was also interested in magic and shit? Well, that is this part of the video now. In early 1939, he was introduced to the Ordo Templi Orientis, a religious organization dedicated to following Thelema, the religion founded by Aleister Crowley. Having already read texts by Crowley in the past, Parsons was very happy about the opportunity to get deeper into Thelema, and met Wilfred Talbot Smith, who was one of the most important Thelemites in America at the time. Smith had basically single-handedly revived the organization and religion in the United States through what was called the Agape Lodge, or the Agape Lodge. I do not know how that is properly pronounced, but it is probably one of the two. Parsons' wife Helen was also very interested in Thelema and the OTO. Maybe a little too interested. in Wilfred Talbot Smith. Parsons went deeper and deeper into the scriptures of Crowley and other important Thelemites, and started introducing acquaintances and friends from both his professional and personal circles to the religion. Even though he'd only been recently inducted into the organization, his reputation for brilliance became so huge so fast that even the big man himself, Aleister Crowley, corresponded with him. The two eventually met and became friends. Oh yes, Aleister Crowley was still alive and well at this point in time. I don't know if that surprises you, but it surprises me every time I hear about it. He only died in 1947. He outlived Hitler. Parsons became so influential within the OTO that many senior figures, even Crowley himself, were floating the idea that he would replace Crowley as the highest person in the organization when he passed. The Parsons, magic and science were not at all mutually exclusive. He believed that thelemic magic, which is written with a CK instead of just a C for some reason, was based on a mechanism not yet understood by the scientific community, and thus he blamed the most magical area of science, quantum physics. And it wasn't like Parsons was being secretive about his ties to the occult within the rocketry world. He would recite Crowley's poem Hymn to Pan regularly during launches and tests, and scribble obscure symbols into the ground. The people around him dealt with this as just eccentric behavior. He was still a genius, he was still a person that you could hang out with, a person you could talk to. He wasn't insane. Frank Molina, meanwhile, tried to get the federal government to invest money into their rocket research program. But they didn't call it rocket research, they called it jet propulsion because of the stigma that was attached to rockets. People didn't like rockets. This is also why it's called the Jet Propulsion Laboratory now, the thing with NASA that all of this was founded from, and not the Rocket Laboratory, because you couldn't have changed the name. They got money to develop jet-assisted takeoff, or JATO, which would allow heavier planes to take off from shorter runways, which was something that the military was very much interested in. Parsons believed that the best way to achieve this would be a solid fuel, which was the thing that the group had been working with from the very beginning. He just needed to figure out what exactly that would be. Solid fuel is more reliable, stable, and easy to transport, making it ideal for military applications. Also, the space shuttle used solid fuel. It does, however, yield less energy than liquid fuels, and in rocket launches today is mostly used for augmenting functions, not the actual rockets themselves, which use liquid fuel. Because they were loud and obnoxious, the group was once again banned from the Caltech campus and sent back to the Arroyo Seco. By the way, NASA and the EPA are to this day working very, very hard to repair the ecological damage that was done to that general area during these experiments. Because back then, when you had dangerous chemicals left over, you just dumped them behind the rock, and nobody even considered that that might not be a good idea. The team was once again expanded, but the FBI, which was of course monitoring them for reasons of national security, didn't allow some people, like for instance Sir Shin-sen, to return because he was suspected to have ties with communism. Which he did. They weren't actually too concerned about Parsons himself, neither for his ties to the ACLU or the OTO. Aided by Air Force engineers and pilots, the team began Project JATO and continued exploding things for several years with the aim of shortening runway requirements. When the United States entered World War II, both the scientists and the military agreed that they were better off researching new technology that could aid the war effort than being men dying at the front lines. Considering themselves leftists ideologically, Foreman, Parsons, and Molina all were very invested in developing technology that would aid the war effort against the Nazis. This is something I always find a bit ironic about spaceflight, by the way. Fundamentally, it's often seen and operated as a peaceful endeavor with scientific goals and done by scientists, and all the scientists are involved, but also it's operated in large parts by the military. Most astronauts were at least at one point in some kind of military, and many of the purposes of astronautics and the whole space thing are military. The European Space Agency is actually the only major space agency in the world that does its work exclusively for scientific and explicitly not for military purposes. Anyway, JATO did eventually develop the technology that would allow Air Force planes to reduce their takeoff requirements by 30%, which was pretty damn good. They formed the Aerojet Engineering Corporation and began selling JATO plane engines to the Air Force, which at the time was not the Air Force yet. And here once again we see this strange conflation of military and scientific interests in the interest of peace, but also not quite, because war. All of the founders of Aerojet wanted to make rockets for the peaceful exploration of space, but the only thing that the company was actually doing was sell rocket assist takeoff systems to the military. But Jack Parsons was dissatisfied with his work. He wanted to develop an even better fuel that would be more stable and yield more force. He continued his research into creating a new, better fuel source and found inspiration in a very strange and unexpected ancient technology: Greek fire. Greek fire, if you don't know, was a weapon used by the Byzantine Empire and could basically just form patches of fire floating on the water. You know, like the stuff from Game of Thrones, except it's not green. There's this common misconception that scientists to this day do not know how it actually worked. This is not true. We could do this in a million different ways. We know how that stuff worked. We just don't know how that specific stuff that the Byzantines used worked. Because of the many techniques that could be employed, we don't have any sources that actually describe the specific recipe that they used. Plus, similar flamethrower weapons were used by many empires throughout history, and they probably all used different recipes. Because he'd read a theory that Greek fire included asphalt, he decided to put asphalt in his fuel. And it worked perfectly at stabilizing his much more volatile fuel mixture. It could now be stored in all climates. It could be stored indefinitely also. It didn't just randomly blow up sometimes, and also it didn't lose any efficiency. Aerojet continued to grow and more government contracts came in. Eventually they did some restructuring, focusing the company on providing war material and reducing the wages of all but the senior-most employees like Parsons. Being rich now again, he used his money to travel across the United States as a corporate representative for Aerojet, but also for the OTO. He met and befriended many influential figures in science and the arts at the time, including Robert A. Heinlein. You've probably heard of him. He's one of the greatest sci-fi writers of all time and also a massive sexist, or possibly not, as not even feminist scholars can agree on this. Yes, he had brilliant and powerful female characters and protagonists in some works, and utterly denigrates and devalues women in others. One thing he definitely was not is a racist. In fact, he was one of the first sci-fi writers to attempt to smash stereotypes against black people during the civil rights era. At the end of the day, the reason he's so influential is because his body of work is just so damn good. But back to Jack. In 1941, his wife left town for a while, and so, naturally, he started having sex with her sister, Sarah, who was 17. This may sound weird, and I do so wish that this sentence did not have a but it does. This was actually something encouraged by Thelema and the OTO. Not fucking your wife's teenage sister while she's out of town specifically, but fucking a lot of different people was. There had been sleeping around in the context of the relationship before by both partners for religious reasons. Parsons was known as a bit of a womanizer. The problem was that Sarah just sort of declared herself to be Jack's wife now when her sister returned. And Jack said, yeah, I mean, you do have to admit she is way hotter than you. Sarah responded to this not by immediately divorcing Parsons, but instead by starting a relationship with their mutual friend and mentor, Wilfred Talbot Smith. And this worked out extremely well for all four of them, apparently. They even moved into the same religious commune together, which was, of course, a huge-ass mansion, and would later become known as the Parsonage. They did the usual things, like making scavenger hunts for the kids, performing ritualistic animal slaughters, having discussions about literature, and setting up an experimental laboratory in the laundry room. Over time, Parsons went ever deeper into Thelema and the OTO, going so far as pretty much giving them all of his money, and also introducing Ed Foreman to the cult. However, this also meant that he started neglecting some of his duties at the Aerojet company. He was often burnt out, unfocused, and made some unnecessary mistakes. There was no question of his brilliance or his passion for rocketry. The real question was, is he more interested in rockets than Thelema still? Part of this was also because of drug use, because Jack Parsons got high as shit all of the time and basically would never come down for the rest of his life. I'm talking everything from weed and cocaine to fucking peyote and opium. He could synthesize a lot of stuff himself in his lab, but credit where it's due, he did never go Walter White. He may or may not also have been bipolar. The last straw broke when the Aerojet Corporation came under police investigation because of cult activity. There had been numerous reports of drug-fueled orgies and fucked up sex rituals, sometimes including minors, and the cops were starting to take them seriously. They were never actually able to definitively prove anything, and the investigation was dropped fairly soon. But basically all of the goodwill that Parsons had had at the Aerojet company was at this point squandered. He was veering away from eccentric and fast entering the realm of crazy. Meanwhile, in the OTO, Aleister Crowley had found Wilfred Talbot Smith a poor leader for the American operations of his cult and demanded he step down, handing interim operations to Parsons. Both Jack and his still wife Helen, who was at this point in a relationship with Smith, urged Crowley to reconsider. Smith didn't like this either, obviously, so Crowley decided to demote him upward by studying astrological data and determining that Smith was actually a god incarnate and could thus not lead the lodge, but had to go to the mountains to become an actual god. Though unhappy about this, political pressure inside the group forced Smith to step down from the OTO. Parsons then quit himself, quite pissed at Crowley at the time, but remained part of the organization after all when Crowley apologized to him. Despite Parsons' lowered performance, Aerojet continued to expand, but was eventually at risk of losing everything when the Navy decided that its JATO technology was no longer providing much of a strategic advantage. The whole point had been to shorten runway distance required, but with more established bases and larger aircraft carriers, this was becoming a bit obsolete. Parsons responded by developing a new JATO fuel that could lift even heavier planes. The only problem was that it produced super poisonous smoke, which made it essentially a chemtrail. Parsons remedied this problem also, and Aerojet was saved. Remember how rockets were considered sci-fi nonsense at the time? Well, all of this changed when the Germans developed the V2. Suddenly there was actually such a thing as a rocket as a weapon, and the Allies were terrified of it. So they reinstated the research group that Aerojet had been built of, even bringing back formerly excluded members because they were so brilliant, also added a whole bunch of other people, and gave them huge stacks of cash. At this point, the operation was officially named the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, because, you know, you still couldn't have named it after rockets, even though obviously this was what they were doing. Orders from the military at Aerojet increased massively, and a major restructuring of the business was in order once again to keep up with the demand. Now being all official, many people at Aerojet wanted both Foreman and Parsons gone. They were, after all, open members of a strange sex cult that did pretty much all of the things that were considered morally reprehensible at the time. Plus, having started all of this as children, blowing up rockets in the backyard of Parsons' grandparents, the two of them hadn't developed the sort of professionalism that was required for satisfactory corporate performance. Basically, the Suicide Squad had sold out. To be fair, Parsons and Foreman did also quite literally. They sold their stock in the company, claiming that after the war, rockets would be done anyway, and they'd rather start a chain of laundromats. Judging by what they did after, including not starting a chain of laundromats, they didn't actually believe this. But with this buyout, both of them made 44 times their initial investment into the company, and Parsons used this money to buy the parsonage. After starting a new engineering corporation, he officially asked for a divorce from his wife, but considered to give her and Wilfred Talbot Smith money. Though Crowley explicitly forbade him from doing this, Parsons welcomed Smith and Helen back into the commune that he now owned after Smith had been to the mountains and, surprise, surprise, not become a god. Despite this, Parsons and Crowley remained friends, and by friends, I mean, seriously, this is some weird shit. In his letters, Parsons would address Crowley as his most beloved father, and sign them with "thy son John," which is especially interesting because pretty much the only person who called him John instead of Jack was his mum. He also began renting out rooms in the parsonage to people who were not part of the OTO or not interested in Thelema at all, so long as they were interesting. One of these people was, I shit you not, Scientology founder L. Ron Hubbard. Of course, he hadn't founded his crazy space alien cult at the time, but was a prolific sci-fi writer who apparently showed great promise and skill at thelemic magic, despite not knowing anything about it. Parsons and Hubbard became friends pretty much immediately, but as these things go, Sarah became more interested in Hubbard than maybe she should have. And they did pretty much immediately have sex, obviously, because such is just the way of the OTO. Being massively jealous, even though he shouldn't have been, and also having way too much time on his hands, Parsons decided that he would have to employ black magic to find himself a new girlfriend, 'cause that's just what people do. His fellow Commune members became immediately wary of this. He just summoned every spirit that he could find in literature, performing strange rituals that filled the property up with poltergeists, lost souls and curses, at least in the heads of the Thelemites, but, there was nothing really they could do about it because he did own the property. My favorite ritual was when he jacked off onto a series of stone tablets to Sergei Prokofiev's Second Violin Concerto, which I would love to be able to show you, but because America has such terrible copyright laws, it is not quite in the public domain there yet. Also, we're on YouTube, and you do not know how often I had songs that were explicitly in the public domain, songs that have existed for 300 years being copyright claimed because of my copyright. He was supported in all these rituals by L. Ron Hubbard, by the way. Parsons would perform the rituals, and Hubbard would observe and measure the magical effects that they had. Whatever the fuck that means. But Parsons wanted more than just to get himself a new girlfriend. Parsons wanted a goddess. Not just any goddess, he wanted the female goddess of Thelema, Babylon. Now, Babylon is interesting because she's basically the Holy Trinity counterpart to the male god of Christianity. I don't want to go into too much detail, but basically Babylon is these three things. First of all, she is the great mother of all life and souls. She is the place from whence every person originates, and the place where every person goes when they die. Then she is also the person who makes people cross the abyss so they may enter the city of pyramids, making them a whole new person. High-level adepts of Thelema travel through the abyss where another deity tries to trap them. Babylon is on the other side of that chasm, luring the adept with sexy stuff. When the adept arrives, they have sex and he gives his blood to her, impregnating her with himself being reborn as a living saint. She's called the Sacred Whore for a reason. Then Babylon is also the Scarlet Woman, who epitomizes female power and sexual freedom. But also, the Scarlet Woman is a person that exists in real life, kind of like a high priestess within the framework of Thelema. According to Aleister Crowley, there were several Scarlet Women over the years, pretty much all of them existing in parallel, but all part of Babylon. I am, by the way, vastly oversimplifying all of this. The cosmology of Thelema is super complicated. One day in 1946, Parsons and Hubbard came back from the desert, convinced that the experiment, the grand quest, the magic rituals had been completed. He found that a woman named Marjorie Cameron, an illustrator and World War II veteran, had joined the parsonage in his absence, and determined that she must be the woman he summoned. But wait! There's more! Cameron was supposed to be part of the ritual for Parsons himself, but the rest of the true magic to summon Babylon into the world was yet to be worked. Parsons wanted to create the physical manifestation of Babylon through Immaculate Conception, not in Cameron, by the way, because he obviously wanted to fuck her all the time, but in some random woman on the earth that with magic he and Hubbard would be able to track. And then her daughter was supposed to be Babylon. The ultimate goal was to trigger the Aeon of Horus, which is basically the age where people realize their full potential and everyone lives peacefully. The usual cult stuff. Crowley was not convinced that Parsons' rituals would work at all. As a matter of fact, he was convinced that they wouldn't work and that Parsons had got insane, which of course, he's one to judge. But it's true that at this point, Parsons' mental state was deteriorating severely. He sold the parsonage, dissolving the commune, but continued living there himself with Cameron, and founded a new company called Allied Enterprises with L. Ron Hubbard and Sarah, who were at this point a couple, and just trying to con him out of his money, really. Hubbard had the brilliant business idea of buying 3 luxury yachts in Miami, going down to Panama, and then selling them there for profit. Thing is, El Ronnie Boy and Sarah were in Miami with the money that Parsons had given them way before Parsons even knew that they were going there. And he was only able to intercept them at the last minute when they were already in the process of fleeing with one of the boats. Apparently, he painted a magic rune on the ground, and that created a storm, a minor one, but a storm, and that forced them to turn back. So, you know, magic works, I guess. Thing is, when they returned, Sarah gently reminded Parsons that she could still sue him for statutory rape, because after all, they had begun their relationship when she was 17 years old. So Parsons got a fraction of the money back that he had given them, and they both left. And that's the last L. Ron Hubbard was ever heard from again. While his old JPL and Aerojet friends saw him as an unfortunate liability, the government still had employment for Jack Parsons. He developed nuclear missiles for North American aviation and was used as a special consultant for explosives by the military and law enforcement. He also married Cameron and became her Thelema mentor. He pretty much completely cut ties with the OTO, though he did stay in touch with Crowley and did continue to be a part of the religion. Things were going pretty well for him. But then came the Red Scare. Now, most of my American viewers will know what the Red Scare is, but for everyone who doesn't know that, and still probably you've heard of it, I'll explain. A Red Scare is basically a moral panic about anything and everything even remotely related to legommunism. In American history, this happened twice, and the Red Scare that is usually referred to as the Red Scare or the McCarthy era is the second one. You probably remember the first from earlier in this video because it blocked a number of Caltech scientists from working on JPL projects. Fears of the Soviet Union and Communist China were growing in the American public after it became known that Soviet intelligence agencies had spies in pretty much all levels of society. These weren't sleeper agents or, some other movie shit, by the way. Most of them were just everyday Americans who were pressured by foreign intelligence with blackmail and threats of violence, and some people who ideologically believed in communism. Inside the halls of government, the right-wing oriented FBI was entangled in a bureaucratic conflict with the more left-leaning CIA, and paranoia among dignitaries and elected officials reached levels so high that they produced propaganda films and shit. The effects of this can still be felt today, by the way. I mean, why do you think the US is so far behind on common sense policies that other Western countries have successfully adopted decades ago? Leading the vanguard of the Red Scare was Joseph McCarthy, a Republican senator from Wisconsin, who fully exploited the political momentum of the Red Scare to paint himself as a virtuous American capitalist and an enemy of the bad people. He also used his accusatory powers to persecute his political opponents. Thousands upon thousands of people were summoned before political committees, where they had to prove that they were in fact not communist, lest they go to jail or at least have their lives completely ruined. Someone just had to accuse you, and you were fucked. Basically, if you had a black friend, or you didn't like war, or you did like Jackson Pollock, you were a communist until proven innocent. This was of course convenient if you were a right-winger trying to smear and disqualify Democrats, and stack institutions with people who agreed with you ideologically. McCarthy loved accusing people of having the big communism, and anyone who spoke out against him was automatically labeled a communist. Any criticism of his practices or the practices of his peers was basically an admission of guilt in the eyes of the public. He did eventually make the fatal mistake of trying to subject the US military to this same process, but his fellow senators informed him that the military is beyond criticism in this country and that he should get fucked. But it wasn't at that point yet in Jack Parsons' life. Parsons had been investigated for communism before and been cleared, but standards had apparently become a lot stricter, and even though he had less to do with his former communist friends than back in the day when he had been cleared, that was enough for his security clearance being revoked. So he was essentially banned from working on anything he was qualified for. So what do when you can no longer work because you've been accused of spying? You make more illegal nitroglycerin in your basement, you jump from job to job, and you separate from your new wife, of course. Remember the thing where Babylon helps you cross the abyss, chasm, and you go into the city of light and then fuck her and be reborn as yourself? Jack Parsons did that during this time. apparently. And he did this employing a series of magical rituals that he paid hookers money for. Oh, and also he actually did become a spy. Well, spy is a harsh word. He did get a job at an aviation company, but also at the same time did some consulting work for the Israeli military and their rocketry program. And apparently he tried to give them corporate secrets. To be fair, it seems like he didn't know that that was what he was doing, and he thought he was just doing his job as a rocket engineer. He just was not doing any of the things that you would expect a person who knows that they're doing something illegal would do. Like, for instance, being secretive about what he was doing at all. The way he was able to get access to these secrets in the first place was because he made it his life's quest to convince the authorities that Thelema was very much a good thing. You see, Parsons was convinced that it wasn't in fact his former ties to communists that had prompted the FBI to investigate him and strip him of his security clearance, but in fact his affiliation with Thelema and the OTO. He presented Thelema as fundamentally anti-authoritarian and pro-individualist, and thus really quite American to authorities in a hearing, and that is what sort of prompted them to give him back the security clearance so they could accidentally do a spy-aroni for the Israeloni. Oopsie. What had actually happened was that the committee just didn't see that he still had ties to communism and didn't consider him to be a security threat for spying for completely different reasons, and this had nothing to do with Thelema. But at this point, Parsons was seeing pretty much everything through a thelemic lens. He spent day and night meditating and thinking and writing about subjects in Thelema, even going so far as declaring the OTO as an organization that would be useless in giving true masters actual mastery about the secrets of Thelema. There was a lot of prophecy involved. He was convinced that very soon Babylon would be physically incarnated and bring about the Aeon of Horus. His wife Cameron came back from Mexico and was outraged that the serial womanizer and sleep-arounder she had married, who was in a sex cult that has you sleep around with people, had been sleeping around. But they did manage to fix things eventually and got their life back on track. They wanted to found a new Thelemic lodge and move to Israel, where Jack could actually work as a rocket engineer. Cameron also did this painting of her husband. It's called Angel of Death, if you'll believe it. Unfortunately, this happiness was not to last. On the 17th of June 1952, aged 37, Jack Parsons died in an explosion while working in his home laboratory. Well, he didn't die there, he died in the hospital later, and he was fully conscious, even though the explosion had ripped off like all of his left forearm and had blown a hole in his face. He wasn't able to talk, by the way, which would have been useful because that would have maybe cleared up some issues that there had been with his death. The obvious and official explanation was that he dropped a coffee can of mercury-2 fulminate, which he was mixing at the time, to the floor because his hands were sweaty because of all the drugs he was taking. That stuff exploded, and then also the rest of the whole lab exploded because there were a lot of explosive chemicals in this explosives lab. However, a lot of people actually believed that this was an assassination and there had been a bomb planted in his lab. And corporates include, but are not limited to, the FBI, who did not want him working for Israel, communists for having snitched on his former allies, Nazis who did not want him working for Israel, Orthodox Jews who did not want him working for Israel for just completely different reasons, Thelemites for magical reasons beyond human understanding, and finally, of course, Parsons himself, because he was at this point pretty mentally degraded, so it's not entirely impossible that he committed suicide. There was a huge media storm after his death. His mum basically killed herself on the very same day, and NASA had to downplay his contributions to rocket science for decades because of just what a disgusting person he was portrayed as in the media. But at this point, everyone has come to accept that in spite of, or probably because he was so crazy, he is definitely one of the top 3 most important rocket scientists in American history. His early contributions to spacecraft design and fuel mixtures, the creation of the JPL out of what had once been 2 boys playing scientists in a backyard, and the legitimization of rockets in the eyes of scientists and authorities are all significant. So significant, in fact, that without him, spaceflight today would look very different. And all that without even ever earning a college degree. Thank you very much for watching this probably longest video on the channel right now. I am terrified that the camera is going to die at any second, so I'm going to do this quick. And yes, somebody will notice this eventually. I do use Wikipedia as the primary source for these videos. These are not academic works. Please do not cite these for anything. Wikipedia is just great because it collates a lot of the information that you have. And if you go down to the sources, there's just brilliant reading material to get into for everything that you are more interested in. Like, comment, subscribe, share, all of the things that you would do with the video. Consider supporting me on Patreon, joining my Discord server, following me on Twitter. In that spirit, have a fantastic day. This was a very multifaceted video, so I don't have advice for you today. But see you around, cunts.